Hi, Gabe and Anthony are here. It's December 3rd, and we are going to be talking about the mental obsession as we do every week or so. The last couple of weeks of this month we're not, and we may try to have a conversation somewhat during the week before the holidays. I'm going to be gone for a couple of weeks, and I imagine a lot of other people will be paying attention to things other than what they normally pay attention to. What our focus is in this discussion is to begin to look at how we utilize our thinking and the impact that the utilization or misutilization of that thinking has on our experience, and then the stories we tell, the presumptions we create to justify somehow trying to fix the thing we're doing in our thinking without actually noticing that we can correct the thinking. We can start actually looking at the thinking accurately and start to see that if the effects we're feeling are coming from the thinking we're doing, then trying to feel better about the feelings we're having basically cements the thinking, because we're trying to avoid responsibility and accountability for actually noticing that we are creating the feelings. We're creating the effects. And to treat the effect rather than the cause is to constantly having to put ointment on a rash and not get to the source of the problem. And the disease in addiction is the mental obsession. It's not an obsession just to do the thing that happens to be the compulsion that you may be struggling with, whether it's drugs, alcohol, sex, food, gambling, relationships. It's not the thing. It's the thinking of it that is the problem. And so what we're going to talk a little bit about this morning, or focus on, is that it isn't necessarily what's happening. It isn't the circumstances or or the people or the things happening that are impacting us, but largely, if not exclusively, what we're thinking about those things and those people and those circumstances that are happening, those combinations of interactions that are happening around us. And if the central nature of the problem is in thinking rather than in being, rather than a spiritual problem, it's a thinking problem, then looking at the thinking we're doing would have a very dramatic impact on the effects we're creating and manifesting. And my experience is that thoughts do not manifest reality, they manifest effects. And the effects feel real because we feel them in our body. We are sentient beings. We're designed to sense things. And when we're sensing things that are wrong, I'm going to suggest that we are sensing thoughts that are wrong as a primary cause of those feelings. So if we can start looking at that and thinking in those terms, the idea that thinking is the problem starts to go away, and it's easy to see that it's the misuse of thinking, the mistaken identity we create in thinking, that thinking who we are is what we think, that begins to be the plague and or the dis-ease created by the discomfort of thinking things that don't really exist as being all that exists. And a mentally obsessive thinking would be a pretty good example of something that people tend to do, thinking they can't stop, thinking it's all that is possible with thinking, and thinking that the only thing that is, and thinking there's nothing they can do about it because it's the only thing that is happening in their thinking process. So Anthony just got ditched, but I'm still with Gabe. And
Yep.
Anyway, good morning, Gabe.
Morning.
So when you're thinking obsessively, or when you're thinking normally, if you haven't had enough breaks in the obsessive thinking, it seems like the only thing thinking can do. Is that accurate? Or the only thing we can do with thinking?
That's a better thing. I think it's the only thing we can do with thinking.
Right. Seems like that, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And so
Anthony's back.
Anthony, you gotta mute.
Yeah, did you get disconnected, or is it just me?
You.
Oh, weird. All of a sudden it just ended. Okay.
Not unusual. I mean, we're dealing with technology that has little unpredictable glimmers of fault too, somewhat like our thinking. So the question, Anthony, that I was asking Gabe is if you're having obsessive thoughts, it seems like the only thing that you can have. And it seems like the only thing that is happening. And it seems like there's nothing else that can happen. And is that consistent in your experience?
Yeah, because and it's I would say so.
So now think of this. If we're so obsessed with what we're thinking to think it's the only thing that we can be thinking, and that all we are thinking is obsessively, and I hear that here one of the consequences of that, and the admission that we may be doing this a lot more than we're thinking we're doing it, is that people often say, "You're asking me to stop thinking. I don't know how to stop thinking." My reaction or response to that is, I'm not asking you to stop thinking. I'm asking you to notice that almost all you're doing is thinking obsessively. So you think when you're being asked to notice that you're thinking obsessively, and also notice that there may be a way to stop thinking obsessively, you think what that means is that you're being asked to stop thinking. So what's interesting about that is that it takes one possibility, which is to begin to unravel the obsessive thinking, and turns it into an impossibility of not thinking, because you'd have to be dead or in a coma to not think. And even when we're in a coma, our bodies are still managing, they're still processing information in our brains to maintain our body, which is why we're in a coma versus being dead at that point. They may say we have no brain activity, but the activity that is going on isn't the one that's interacting with the world around us as much as it is the one that's basically maintaining the bodily functions we tend not to think about.
Yeah.
Let's give an example of that, Jack. I watch Forensic Files. I love that show. This son murdered his parents for the insurance money, and he used an axe. And his dad got up the next morning, went outside for the paper, and tried to make cereal before he collapsed, because the wounds didn't go deep into the core of the brain at the brainstem, and just did the sort of more upper wounds. So like the brain can operate and the body can operate with severe fatal trauma, and continue to operate. The next thing I wanted to say, Jack, is I do, and I'm not bragging here, but I try to do very complex tensor calculus and physics because it actually relaxes me, because my brain is focused on the problem on the page,
yes,
and not the problem on my head.
Right. Right. Well,
It's
so
very relaxing to.
one of the
math makes perfect sense too. That's the other good thing.
think of the redundancy of focusing on the problem in your head. And if the problem in your head was sane, like the problem on the paper, right? The problem on the paper probably has a solution, right?
Yeah, an exact
the
solution.
The problem on your head is actually caused, the dissolution is only possible if you start noticing that what you're doing and you're thinking is insane. Because the idea of mentally obsessive thinking is thinking that our thoughts are truth and reality, which means we have to constantly think about them to maintain that line of thinking. So there's no reason in it at all except the reason and excuses we use to continue, which are just rationalizations and justifications. If you follow that, the problem on the page gives you a chance to actually work something out. Like mathematics is great for that, algebra and calculus and all that. It gives you, like writing does the same thing. And actually any action that produces a productive result, gardening helps. Doing anything with your hands that's expressing, if you're thinking about doing something, if it's cleaning the kitchen, making your bed, cleaning the glove box, your trunk, you're washing your car, if you're seeing something happen for what you're thinking about, it confirms what you're thinking is there to be doing, which is to be productive, useful. But the thinking about thinking within the thinking about thinking becomes just a redundancy of thought. Good morning, Lenses.
Good morning, Jack. Good morning.
So I'm going to finish a thought with Gabe here, and then I'll go back a little bit and talk about what we're talking about, since we're talking about what we're talking about. If we're doing so, this is why in sobriety people are told to take action. The thing that's missed in that comment is that thinking is an action because it's a choice. And if we choose to think something and that something is happening, it doesn't mean that what's happening is real. It just means we're imagining something that's happening, right? That's how thoughts work. So if I all of a sudden think what I'm thinking is truth and reality, I all of a sudden believe my life depends on maintaining that thought. That's an obsessive thought. Because now I have to think all the time about it, not to resuscitate my life, but to keep my life from being threatened, which is why I'm so reactive and impulsive when it comes to other people's thinking or sitting still. I can't sit still typically in that case because I'm constantly having to regurgitate these thoughts, which create a very discomforting feeling. Very uncomfortable. So uncomfortable that I always want to be on the move, moving in a direction. And that's what leads to compulsions. Compulsions are the impulsive nature of trying to pretend that reactivity is serving any interest at all other than the automated defense of thoughts that aren't true in the name of them being true. So getting back to the previous point, if we're thinking obsessive thinking is all we can do, and then as a result, we think that's what thinking is, now we've concluded there is no other option than to do that, meaning there's no useful purpose for thinking. And isn't it interesting how self-serving that line of reasoning becomes in terms of thinking that the obsessive diseased nature, the diseased nature of the obsessive thinking is the only thing we can possibly do. We're eliminating in our own thinking that there's any solution. So all we do is keep thinking and thinking and thinking how we can feel better about what we're doing, when in fact trying to feel better about it or get over it is actually reinforcing the thought we're maintaining as the cause of the whole thing to begin with. We're avoiding the cause by focusing on the effect. And again, that's backward. A lie only remains a lie as long as it's thought to be true. As soon as a lie is a lie, it's true. So there's no power in it at that point. And the power we think is in it is delusional to begin with, but it feels like power because it seems to grip us and seems to have us and seems to be happening to us and seems to be out of our control. All of those things seems to be completely unmanageable, largely because if I've got an obsessive thought and I'm thinking from an obsessive thought, I'm going to fix the obsessive thought with more thinking. I'm going to have another obsessive thought thinking I'm going to fix the obsessive thought, and I'm maintaining the obsessive thought in the process, rather than having a sane thought that we'll talk about next here. Having a sane thought coming not from obsessive thoughts, not from relying on the obsessive thoughts and thinking about thinking and thinking about more thinking and thinking that what I need to do is have a new version of the old thinking that just continues to perpetuate that thinking, but starting to see that the disturbance, the discomfort, the sense of dis-ease that's emanating, that I'm feeling, the impulsive nature of trying to run from this impossible situation is coming from a greater sense of knowing that something is wrong. If I didn't have a greater sense of knowing, I wouldn't think of that stuff any more than you're describing it, Gabe, as being the only thing that can be happening. So it becomes the only thing I do, and it becomes the only thing I redo, and continues to perpetuate on itself. If I didn't know better, I wouldn't be suffering. I wouldn't feel uncomfortable. If I didn't know comfort, how could I feel uncomfortable? What would be my gauge? So this conversation is about looking at being, if we can be engulfed by our thinking or feel that we are, we're basically thinking that we are, and as a result, we're feeling what we're thinking. Thinking manifests effects. Doesn't manifest reality, it manifests effects. Then we act on those effects to transform something in our world, relationships, our interaction with something or another, to have those things then look like the problem, the same way we're trying to think the feeling is the problem rather than the cause of thought. And that's a loop. If we didn't have that knowing sense, it would seem normal to us, it would be healthy for us, and it would not be unnatural at all. So starting to notice that the actual discomfort is actually our body language speaking to us, because we translate all of those feelings and those bodily sensations into words, which means we're thinking about them. And the words we translate them to, if they're looked at and thought of simply as words reflecting the thinking, the words will start telling us how the thinking is doing. If we feel bad, we're having a bad thought. If we feel wrong, we're having a wrong thought. We do not need to know why. We don't need to know any more what than that. And we don't need to know when and where, because it's happening here and now. It's presently happening wherever we are all the time, because it's the only place anything ever happens is in the present. So it isn't what's happening that bothers us as much as how we think of what's happening, because there's nothing closer to the impact on our bodily sensation than how we think, since the thinking we're doing is happening in the brains we have, in the heads we have, in the bodies we have, each of us. And to rely on the obsessive thinking is also to think there's no solution whatsoever, because the solution is the only choice I have, which is to keep doing what I've been doing. That's addiction in a nutshell. It's a perfect definition for addiction. I have no other choice. Because I really think what I'm doing sickly is reality. It isn't. It's a mistaken identity. It's a misutilization of thought. It undermines our entire bodily system with anxiety and stress. Every single disease, if you read the diagnosis, almost all are attached to anxiety and stress. Either they're enhanced by more anxiety, or the disease is enhanced, means it gets worse the more the anxiety and stress, or the healing comes from a relaxation of that anxiety and stress, like you described going to Mexico, Gabe. There's some time out in all that. So the circumstances change. So the addiction to the normal idea that the circumstances are to blame all of a sudden isn't there, because they're calmer and more peaceful, and the experience changes, which I would suggest shows how flexible the thinking really is to be so quickly changed by simply changing our environment. So to think we're stuck in our head when it's actually our brain that's stuck in our skull, the thoughts aren't stuck in our head, they're incredibly flexible. If we can make them feel better by doing something, they aren't stuck. It's our insistence they continue to be what we think they are and think that someday they'll become true the longer we think of them that we're struggling with. So it isn't what's happening, but what we're thinking about what's happening that causes the greatest impact on our experience.
Done for the day. Thanks, Jack.
See ya.
Thanks, Jack.
Perfectly. I like the just the not being useful, not being there. Like you're just you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing when you're thinking obsessive. You're not.
Well, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing because that option is always available and you can always create it. But it doesn't mean it's useful. It doesn't mean it's productive. It's actually not useful because it's destructive.
Yeah.
It not only weighs on our own body, all of our interactions start to become crippled by it because we're expressing a toxic, poisonous, corrupt basis. We're triggering reactivity in other people and fear by operating on that basis. So it isn't so much what we think about here in terms of being done, for instance, to your point, Gabe. It isn't a matter of hearing that information. If we're not applying it in our own experience, it's absolutely not useful whatsoever. The words will never add up to enough to dispel the rumors that we spread in our head, because to any degree that any of us are thinking obsessive thoughts right now, and I would concede that certainly there are things in my thinking that I don't even think I'm thinking that must be obsessive for me not to be thinking I'm thinking them, right? That alone is sort of a clue that I'm in some form of denial or resisting or trying to hide something that I'm doing in the name of thinking that if I don't look at it, it's not happening. Right? So if that's the case, it's not until I actually apply and have life confirm reality by me thinking honestly about what's going on rather than inaccurately and dishonestly, the confirmation allows the conformation. I begin to confirm reality by a sense of peace because I'm aligning in my action with truth and reality, which is the basis of my knowing presence. And it's not mine, it's ours. I only think of it as mine because when I'm introducing it to my thinking is what I do independently of everyone else. I get to think for my thinking. I get to choose my thinking in my own brain, as we all do. Yet if the basis of our existence is the same, all the differentiations we're trying to use in our thinking to identify ourselves as independent and individual of one another is simply overlooking the fact that we're not independent or apart from anyone or anything. And so again, it starts to reinforce the idea that my thinking is everything because it's independent of everyone else, and I feel alone and I feel disconnected, not because I am, but because my thinking seems to have become my reality. And so those things I'm doing are lonely and disconnected because they have no basis in reality. So I'm actually arguing in the name of non-existence, which is what addiction is. It's the idea that we do the wrong thing more and get better, which would be in any compulsion, basically a slow form of suicide claiming to be saving our life. So if it weren't for the knowing nature, we wouldn't recognize what's wrong. And in effect, the recognition of what's wrong confirms that we know more than we're thinking. And that's largely what this conversation is about. Our discussion is starting to notice that we have that awareness, that awareness is actually confirmed in the discontent and the irritability and the restlessness and the struggle and the anxious, the anxious disorders that we suffer and all that stuff. It's confirmed because those things wouldn't be happening if we were aligned with our reality. They're happening because we're making believe that they are reality and they are the only reality. And as a result, the only thing we can do is to continue to perpetuate them, and that's all thinking is. And that's not true. Thinking actually is designed to help guide us and help serve us and each other to do the best thing we can, the most productive thing, which means the most abundant thing. That's the design of the body. The misuse of it is this other addictive tendency that's been historically a problem in humanity. As a species, this has been going on a long time. So it may take a minute to come to terms with it.
I missed a few weeks from my kids in the vacation. And I got a little uneasy again, a little wobbly, even with the vacation, because when I returned, it was a shit show. But, it's nice to get back with you on the walks in the morning to sort of maintain our daily maintenance, weekly maintenance.
Yeah, thanks. It's the same for me, Gabe. I think the confirmation is the confirmation in terms of discussing it. Again, I don't think it's what I say that makes any difference at all. It's what's done with it. Because if we each have an absolute knowing sense, then we each know what to do, but we've been so deficient in our action that is anything less than what we think that we've almost pretended we don't even know what we know. And if that gap is there, it's just in thought that it's there. It's not really there. It can't really be there in reality. But it's just a continued use of this other thinking that we've got to think about the thinking more and more and more, and we're going to get it better. And finally, we'll achieve that peace and we'll achieve that reality and that absolute truth, rather than see that it's the actual, that if I'm relying on obsessive thinking, I'm relying on insanity. Then what is my next thought going to be but insane? It's just a new looking thought doing the same old thing over and over and over again. So seeing this, understanding is how we see substance. And if you think of the two words, they're both referring to a foundation. Understanding, meaning beneath where we stand, the positions we take. Substance, beneath our stance, the positions we take. The thing we think we can't see, we see in understanding. If we begin to apply understanding to what we think we can't see, we begin to include substance into the thinking we're doing rather than simply rely on what we can see as a form and a shape and an articulation and a color, like the body. All bodies have substance. All matter has substance that is unseen. And yet it doesn't go away any more than the world disappeared beyond the horizon when people thought the horizon was the end of the world. It's the same kind of thinking. If we think our thinking is everything, we think the limit of our thinking dooms us rather than actually provides us a chance to go to look beyond the thoughts and start seeing that we can see right past the end as soon as we're willing to notice that the end has no fear in it, that the end of that thought actually provides that possibility. It's just our thinking we've used to almost bully ourselves into a reactive state of seeming mind and body. So talking about it helps. And the application of the thoughts in your own experience is really where the rubber meets the road, per se, where you can see the difference. And the difference is if we've been relying on insanity as reality and we start relying on reality as reality, it doesn't take a lot to start noticing a very different experience because the stability becomes obvious now to the thinking. The stability's always been in place. It just hasn't been in place in terms of what we've been thinking because all we've been thinking is what we're thinking is right when it's been wrong. That's a mouthful.
But I could, in the day, Jack, design and build buildings, do engineering, advanced calculus, and my best thought was to get a bottle of scotch at
Right.
7 a.m.
Right.
So what's
Well, if we're reliant on sick thinking, it would be normal to come to those conclusions. And it doesn't make sense once you start looking at it accurately any more than the thinking makes sense once you start looking at it accurately. The freedom from alcohol or any compulsion is not all of a sudden not having the compulsion, but noticing what the compulsion is and beginning to take the compulsion dissipates when the thought dissipates. And the thought, as far as the big book goes, says, as long as we thought we could control and enjoy it, we continued. That was the thought. So what am I trying to control and enjoy? Insanity when it comes to my thinking. Versus realizing that there is no control in an absolute knowing state, and there is no insanity in an absolute knowing state. Those are unnatural, imposed, induced conditions based on what I'm thinking, not reality or truth. Morning, Jackie and Jana, by the way.
Morning.
So if the only problem is based on the problems I'm creating in my thinking, the knowing awareness begins to be a little clearer as a source that we've never lost and can't lose. It isn't an option to have this, and yet because it's everything, we can't be condemned to having it because you cannot be condemned to having everything. If anybody said, I've got everything, I've been given everything, and I'm really condemned, that would not make much sense. Generally, people who are condemned feel restricted, constricted, limited in what they're doing and what they're able to do. Condemned to that limitation. So as we've talked about before, my sense is we do not struggle with love, we struggle with like, which is a choice. We struggle with don't like, which is a choice. And when we like something, there's something else we don't like automatically. Because in the process of change, there's always two things. If I like something, it means I'm on the side of like rather than don't like. I don't like vanilla, I like chocolate. doesn't mean I have to like vanilla. It simply means it's a choice to like chocolate. If I think my thoughts are true and real, I think the only thing I can ever have satisfaction from is chocolate. And when there's vanilla, I'm terribly disappointed. It's not because vanilla doesn't have any merit or doesn't taste good. It's because my thought about it, being that I think it's real, I end up thinking it's the only thing I can ever have that's going to make me happy. So anything less than that won't make me happy. All induced by the thinking, not reality, not what's
And
actually happening.
if you go to therapy, you never sit there for a couple hours talking just about how great everything is, right? Oh, let's just spend the time talking about how wonderful life is. You sit there and focus on the problems.
Well, and here, if the problem is in thinking, and we talked about this a little before, Anthony, if the problem is in the thinking and we know that, and all we're doing is constantly talking about our problems, we're thinking those problems are unique to us rather than seeing that it's the same thing for everybody. It's just a misuse of identification. It's literally ID theft, making believe once I think my thoughts are real, I think I become thoughts. So think about this. Thinking of itself, when I'm thinking of my thinking itself, and I determine that that self-thinking becomes me, I've now become my thoughts, and I have no perspective once I'm in my thoughts. So I don't think there's anything I can do but continue. That's why somebody said yesterday, Gabe, I think Stacy said he felt stuck in his head. What's really stuck? His focus on the thinking obsessively. The thinking. He says, I haven't listened to anything you guys have said today. He was admitting, very honestly, that his preoccupation kept him from hearing anything. So the obsessive nature of thinking is thinking that all that's happening is the obsession to the exclusion of what's actually happening, but we know what's actually happening, regardless of what we think. We just want to give credit to thinking as being so real as to think we didn't hear a thing. It's the same with expectations. If all I think is my thinking is real, all I think that should ever happen is what I originally thought would happen when I had the first thought about whatever eventually happened that I said I didn't like or didn't want because it wasn't what I thought would happen when I first thought the thought to get whatever it is I ended up with. So if the thought's faulty, we're going to end up with exactly a mirror image of that faulty thought. And to think it should be something else is to show how dedicated we are to the idea that our thinking should only produce the results we imagined would happen and nothing else, which also means nothing better. Not just everything worse, but nothing better. And yet, what's the focus normally? Only on what's worse. It's a pretty good indication if we're constantly focused on what's wrong and what's bad, that we're fixated on something wrong to be focused on what's wrong and bad, rather than notice that if everything wrong and bad is finite in any way, then anything else is good and right, would be much more acceptable. But we don't tend to think of those terms when we're thinking obsessively. People don't tend to come to me and talk about suffering from an abundance of happiness. They talk about feeling bad, feeling disconnected, feeling low self-esteem, low self-worth. That would not be the case if they were entertaining thoughts that were abundant and that were honest and that reflected truth and reality or expressed truth and reality. Because that's what truth and reality is abundant. Absolute, not shaking, not unstable. So Anthony, I talked a little bit earlier, and we've gotten close in this conversation, is that we tend to focus a lot on the problems, thinking they're individual and we need to treat each person individually rather than see that the underlying issue here, the substance, is the same.
Yeah.
It's just thinking something that isn't true is going to be true. The more I think about it and the harder I think about it and the more I insist on thinking about it, while in fact the insistence creates the persistence of the discomfort that I'm trying to make believe I want to get away from or get over or feel better than. And the fact is, if we spent time thinking about all the things we could do on the basis of our absolute state of being, those other thoughts would vanish in a minute, just like darkness vanishes when you flip the light switch, if the light bulb's working. So the light is, it's like we talk about the sun going down. Sun doesn't go down. The effect we have when we're on the opposite side of the planet looks like it goes down. Just like when the clouds are out, the sun is still out, but we say the sun isn't out today. No, the sun's out. There's just clouds in the way. It's the same in our thinking. If we think we're obstructed, it's just thoughts giving us that impression. And because we think they're real, we believe they've obstructed the sunlight. They haven't. But to thinking they have, the thinking thinks that because the thinking is sick. It's diseased. It's toxic. It's insane to be thought of as real. It's not insane to have the thought that clouds block the sun. That's not insane. But to think the sun is not out is the same thing as thinking that our light is out, that we have no light, that we have no greater knowing, that we have no greater sense of presence and awareness, that there is nothing when we think there is nothing, when in fact, if there was nothing, we wouldn't be thinking. You start looking at this, you start seeing how absurd it is that we even make believe we don't belong when you can't not belong if you don't belong. It's impossible. If you didn't belong, you wouldn't be struggling over it. So for Jackie and Jana, this started with the idea that nothing affects our experience more than what we think of what's happening rather than what's actually happening. And when we're thinking all that's happening is obsessive thinking, the fear that's created isn't because we're thinking about something as reality. It's because we know that we're not paying attention to what's actually happening that's going to cause something that's fearful. We're aware of it. The clarity of our insight is proven by the discomfort we create. It's evidence that we know better. So what do we do with that?
I guess part of the problem too, just thinking about it, Jack, is that you can only change so much. Like if I want to wake up tomorrow and not like strawberries anymore, it doesn't happen that way. It's like I'm gonna like strawberries. So there's only so much you could really change. You can't change who you are. You can change some of your thinking, but it's just a little, it's not a lot. It's like you're kind of stuck in a certain box in a way.
Well, within your thinking, you're right, but not within your knowing, because knowing doesn't change. So if you're talking about only being able to change a little, you're missing the fact that everything is always changing. Everything is always changing. Everything. When it comes to things.
Well, I know when I opened the door this morning to get the paper, the sun wasn't exactly shining where I like it. I'm like, you know what? I'm not getting the full advantage of the sun right now because it's not really hitting my house. So I started off this morning kind of upset where my
Where's
house
the problem? Where's the problem? Where is the problem? The sun's
that
doing
sun,
exactly.
we just got to fix that sun. It'll be fine.
Where's the problem?
With me.
Well, with what about you?
It's not getting enough sun. I want more sun in the morning. I'd like
Where's that
morning
coming
sun.
from?
My human body likes the feeling of sun.
Okay. What's the basic cause of that feeling?
My head, my thinking.
Yeah. So it's a decision you make. It's a choice you make. Now, if you're free to make that choice, Anthony, and you feel condemned by the choices you make, does that make any sense to you?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, it can't. I mean, if you're looking at it honestly,
Talk to my mom about that one.
if you're looking at it honestly, it can make sense to the degree that you begin to see that there's a conflict in that. So there's no conflict in reality and truth because there aren't any bits and pieces. There's no conflict in love because there are no bits and pieces. It's an absolute state of nature.
Yeah, like that thing that said, just because you ignore the facts doesn't mean they're not still there.
Right. Aldous Huxley, if I remember. You sent that this past week.
Yeah.
So ignoring something doesn't mean it's not there. If that's the case, then all the things we think we're not thinking about right now, or we're still thinking about, and they're still happening, but we think ignorance of them is smart and wise. That wouldn't line up, would it?
Yeah. And there's probably 100 things I need to think of at all. Like there's 100 things I'm processing, different things. And
it's a lot more than you could even count.
Yeah. Well, I mean, big decisions.
They have said that we're only having so many thoughts a day and all that. Come on, who's really calculating that properly?
How many thoughts do you have a day, would you say?
I don't, however many I have. My sense is the part that we're missing is the part that we don't think is there. And talk about a missing person. We think the part we don't think about isn't there, while in fact there's a part happening that we don't think is there while it's happening. There's another conflict. This thing we call the subconscious. Bill talked about it as lurking thoughts. What's lurking? It's kind of a tense environment, a haunted environment somewhat. Maybe gonna take me over, grab me from behind. That's a fear we have about doing something and thinking we're not doing that thing. We're creating the fear, we're inducing the fear by acting as though we don't know better while we know better. And if we didn't know better, it wouldn't cause the fear. We'd think we were in control. It would put us at perfect ease. The lack of ease is caused by the thinking we're doing about the thing happening. And also, the thing happening is the thinking we're doing. That's also happening because it's a choice. It's something that happens. It's something we do. It isn't something happening to us until we think we have nothing to do with it. And then ironically, we think it has everything to do with us. Interesting, right? Kind of a sick twist. I think I have nothing to do with it. And all of a sudden I think it is only focused on attacking me, getting me. Interesting. And
then my thought was, I could just spend more time over there where the sun is. It doesn't have to actually come to me. But I'm like, well, that's not really fair.
I wouldn't say you're getting at the core of the issue. I mean,
I started thinking, why does my neighbor get? My neighbor is actually getting the perfect sun right now. That's really terrible. Why does he get the sun?
So
knowing that I get it at a different time where he's probably thinking.
We can keep defining that. We can keep talking about that. But if you look at it honestly, Anthony, you're admitting the flexibility of those thoughts to be so easily manipulated by all the various ways you think things could be that they're not.
Yeah.
So you're actually, the essence of what's happening includes everything we need to know because it's all that's happening that is known. So when we keep looking for knowledge somewhere else, we're thinking it isn't where we are. It's all built in and baked into the experience we're having in the present moment. The only question is, how long am I going to go before I begin to admit where things are wrong?
Yeah.
So I can begin to disband the cacophony of the band that I've been playing in the back of my, and start to actually say, wow, I'm actually causing this experience.
That's where those speakers in AA will say, I wish everybody the gift of desperation.
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't seem like a gift to someone who's desperate. But again, for the simple reason that it's not until you begin to see that desperation is actually, it's sort of like coming up against your midterm in math or algebra, and you haven't done any studying. You haven't paid attention to what's happening well enough. And so you have a certain trepidation.
Yeah, and then when they say like find X, and you just circle X right on the graph.
So if we're causing it and we start conceding that and just noticing it, there's nothing we need to do about it, because you're going to notice that there's a lot happening that you don't think you're doing at all, and it continues to happen. Brains think. That's what they're designed to do, and they're going to continue to think as long as we have one, as long as our heart is beating and the blood is pumping and the oxygen is getting to our brain, we're going to be thinking. And so
the sun not hitting my house exactly right is the kind of thing you just don't tell anybody, and I'll carry that around. And every time I go out, I'm like, damn it, that sun is just the wrong spot. But as soon as I bring it up, it kind of takes it away, and like it is. I realize I'm spending a lot of time thinking about that.
Well, for somebody who doesn't tell anybody, you certainly have gone on quite a while today.
Nobody wants to hear that the sun just isn't hitting my house right.
The point is, Anthony, we're trying to make things that don't exist into things that will never add up anyhow. They're just thoughts you're having, and you're welcome to have those thoughts. The freedom of the thinking is seeing that we're free to think. If you end up condemned by the thinking you're doing, I think I started on this point and did maybe not have finished it. If you're feeling condemned by the thinking you're free to do, you have freely chosen condemnation as your experience. To see
out of habit, only out of habit. It's a habit.
What's
it's a
that?
bad habit. Just thinking the negative. It's a bad habit. I always try to find the flaws.
Think of how you're trying to excuse what you do right now. It's a bad habit. I'm not doing something habitually that's bad. It's a bad habit.
And it's unfixable. It's a bad habit. It's unfixable.
It lives in a box in the kitchen that's a bad habit that I keep doing. Think of it. You're attributing it to having some power over you when in fact you are the habitual habiter.
Yeah.
You're the one choosing it. You're thinking someday this is going to be right and real the longer I do it. That's the vain hope, just like for an alcoholic drug addict.
Yeah.
The vain hope is someday I'll be able to drink like normal people. I'll be able to use drugs moderately.
Yeah, I love the way this one speaker said, he goes, I got in a lot of trouble drinking. And instead of just normal person would have just stopped. But they said, I've got to find a way to make this work.
So sanity certainly isn't insanity, right?
Why do you say that? Oh, sanity isn't insanity. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we're thinking insanely and thinking it's sane, that would be a perfect way to continue thinking insanely.
Right.
Because we think it's right.
You have to. Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart.
You don't have to, but it's a pretty good odds you're going to continue.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're setting it up. You're actually creating the environment for that. Addiction is the idea that we can turn what's false into truth.
Recording in progress.
I think we got you twice, Jackie. I'm going to mute one of you, Jackie. There you go. Okay. I'll unmute you. If we're creating a conflict and we're thinking it's real, there's no conflict in truth and reality. Let's just start there. Because truth is always true. And we're not talking about these human truths that we come up with, very clever ways of thinking something's true and real because it works every time, because there we're just talking about nature. And the law and order of nature has always been present. The fact that we can make something work means we're aligning with nature. It doesn't mean it's true for our experience. It means it's accurate within truth, right? Law and order of nature would be an expression of truth and reality, right? Because the order of the universe seems to be doing pretty well without our thinking, seems to have been operating well before we started thinking in ways to allow us to eventually think and continue to think today. So it seems to be working pretty well. Doesn't mean we haven't had an impact on it that reflects the poison toxic thinking we do, because we certainly have. If we're honest about the fact that we've been here and we've had any impact at all, we could certainly be honest about the impact we've had without having to try to quantify it. And just know that if we made bad decisions, the effects of those bad decisions actually have impaired nature in some way. Doesn't mean nature can't recover. Just means that we've had impacts that aren't always healthy. And as a result, we have consequences that aren't always abundant. But this idea of addiction says it's false, and I'm going to turn it into truth. And I'm just going to keep thinking about it until it becomes that. It's kind of like kids with their imaginary friends when they're kids, thinking as an adult that they're going to keep thinking about those imaginary friends, and those imaginary friends are going to become real. And thinking fantasy is reality is exactly what defines insanity. It isn't too far reaching to think insane thoughts. You don't have to be checking into a mental hospital to do that. But if you do it long enough, you may well end up there. Suicide is at an all-time high. It's a good indication we're not thinking very well when people in greater numbers are killing themselves thinking they're resolving the problem. It's the same thing we do when we start compulsively acting in any direction. We think we're solving the problem while we're perpetuating the problem. Suicide is like the last self-centered act of proof that someone's in control while they're out of control to come to that conclusion. So our ability to talk about this honestly is a chance to actually convey some thoughts that may be helpful to people who are struggling and thinking they have no other option and there is nothing else to do. Because when I think all that's happening is what I'm thinking, I think there's absolutely no solution to the problem, because I can't imagine anything beyond the obsession of the thinking. All I feel is the pain and misery and desperation of that sick thinking. To understand that it's not true, regardless of what I think, and that it's not everything, regardless of what I think, it's limited to the thoughts I'm having, is to start maybe noticing that what I'm thinking isn't true. And if I can begin to notice that maybe what I'm thinking isn't true and what I'm thinking is simply imagined, takes a little bit of the pressure off to think that I need to continue. Just like when I admitted I was powerless over alcohol, I realized that I'd never admitted that. I'd always thought I had some form of control, which compelled me to prove I did by doing more and more and more of it, thinking someday it would get right, someday I would do it right, someday the circumstances wouldn't justify me continuing to do so wrong, to go so wrong.
Very small, big, average plastic shop. Small fries and a drink.
Is this really all just don't take yourself so seriously?
Well, if you're actually looking at this, there's no self to take seriously. If you're looking at this honestly, we've taken thinking about thinking itself as ourself. That isn't us.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was thinking that's really all you're saying is just don't take yourself so seriously, but you have another side to that, which is good.
You're right, though, Anthony, to the point that we've been taking our thinking as reality so seriously.
Yeah.
We think the only thing we can do is kill ourselves. And compulsions are all suicidal thoughts and expression. Suicidal ideation is how Jackie puts it. We become transfixed with this idea of eliminating ourselves in the name of stopping the problem, but we think the problem is who we are because we think all of our thinking is only who we are. All we are is what we think. We're trying to kill the thinking rather than notice the thought has no life anyhow. It's all delusional. That's the insanity of it. That's why the conclusion of killing ourselves is insane. It's the only form of murder that can't be prosecuted, suicide. So this has global implications. And the fact that it hasn't been discussed openly, as far as I can tell, because I've listened and read and done a lot for a long time and haven't heard people talk about it as openly as we tend to, and I tend to with the people I discuss it with. And it's not because I'm doing it, it's because it's always been this way. And we just haven't been talking about it. Why? Because we've been talking about the problem. We've been obsessed with the problem. We've been obsessed with everything that's wrong with everyone else rather than noticing what's wrong in our own experience and what we're creating that's wrong, and starting to say, if I'm at the center of it and I begin to admit it, I begin to dispel a lot of rumors about the other people that I'm seeing and see that they are also struggling mentally too. They've probably got some thoughts in that head of theirs that aren't quite right. And I'm certainly not doing them any good, helping them develop more and more and more of them when I have the perfect potential to simply begin to express honestly the fact that I do what I do the way I do it, and sometimes what I do is insane and doesn't make sense, and it's irrational and illogical and preposterous. And by the way, reality and truth to insanity is illogical, unreasonable, and preposterous. So when we hear something that might be actually true and we're thinking obsessive thoughts, we're going to think the first thing to do is fight those things. And hear that those things are attacking us and threatening us rather than starting to be aware of the fact that we're actually observing. What we're aware of is not the attack that's coming from the outside source, but the fact that we have been wearing that condemnation and that sense of defensiveness in our own experience. We're starting to actually witness our own experience, but thinking it's happening by somebody else, so we blame them rather than say, no, they're giving me a chance to notice that I'm doing this. My reaction is actually an acknowledgement of my defensiveness and my denial and my defiance and my delusion.
A lot of my friendships, I'm just thinking about it. It's not like they call me and just tell me how great everything is. I probably wouldn't really want to listen to that, but they'll tell me their problems, and then we'll sit and try to figure it out. That's kind of like the way the relationship is. Problem solving.
Co-conspirators in misery.
Yeah. Something didn't go right. Here's what happened. Oh my God. Instead of like,
Anthony, there's nothing wrong with looking at things and saying, what are we doing wrong here? I mean,
yeah.
Orville and Wilbur spent a long time trying to figure out how to get the shape of a wing so it flies. They knew that if they were going to fly, they didn't want to crash.
Yeah.
And the point is that there's nothing we do that's wrong until we think it's the only thing we can do. And that idea that it's the only thing we can do is coming from the idea that it's true and real, and there is no other option. So if there are other options, and what we're thinking about is simply imagined, and begin to realize that life, by its nature, is the nature of everything that surrounds us, including the bodies we have and the thoughts that we have. It starts to take the load off of me thinking it's up to me and starting to see that it's really up to us. And how things are going is exactly the way we want them to be going when we're honest about the sick thinking that we're doing that gets them to the places that we claim we don't want to have happening. If we don't like what's happening in the world, we would act better to not have it happen. By the same token, if we don't like what's happening and it keeps happening, we must like it enough to continue to have it happen, which shows exactly what addiction does. The idea that I can drink more and do more drugs as a solution is that same kind of thinking we do with the problems on our planet that we seem to be struggling with as a species. If we have any superior capacity, the superior capacity would be in the well-being of all others rather than the destruction or the diminishment or the depreciation of anyone or anything. Doesn't mean we can't have problems along the way and say, I understand that the Vikings learned how to make glass because they used to make huge bonfires in their freezing cold climate when they pulled up to shore at the end of a day. And those bonfires sat in sand. And at the end of the bonfires, they started noticing these little pieces of glass. And glass is made out of sand. So now if you try to figure out how to make glass, nobody knew what glass was, so nobody tried to figure it out. But once they figured it out, they began to see, oh, this could be useful somehow.
I mean, I never saw any Viking ships with glass. I don't know.
Well, I'm not suggesting they had glass panes manufactured immediately, but they noticed that there was between fire and sand, something happened that was interesting to them. These little crystalline, clear goblets of glass were created. So humans have discovered that stuff. It's not because we discovered it, it's because we actually discovered how to utilize it and what the chemical reactions were that were correct enough to produce the result that was always possible, always possible. So if we're thinking from an impossible basis, we're going to find impossibility and help each other develop their problems so that we can continue to say, yeah, that's just life. Life's a struggle. Life's a problem. Life's hard. It isn't. None of those things apply to life. They all apply to how we think about what's happening. So there's
Let's see. It's
another chunk to
just
swallow.
well, just for the fact check part of our listeners at home, it says nothing indicates that the Vikings could produce glass for windows, but there is no doubt that they were familiar with the material from Europe, where glazed windows had long been a feature of churches.
But you're thinking of glass only as windows now.
Uh-huh.
And I'm talking about the fact that they discovered when they lit those fires in sand that there was a remnant, a byproduct. They didn't make glass out of it. Nobody even imagined that glass was important. They just noticed something to begin with.
How come it says they were familiar with the material from Europe, where glazed windows had long been a feature of churches?
Okay, I'm going way before that.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, sorry to go off on a tangent.
The point is, if you light a piece of paper and never knew that paper was flammable, you would notice that nature is doing for us what we couldn't otherwise do if we didn't interact with it in a productive way.
This one does say new research shows Vikings had glass windows. A senior researcher, National Museum of Denmark, has discovered that Vikings had windows with glass panes long before.
Okay, so when they discovered glass, they didn't discover windows. It came as a result of discovering the glass. I'm talking about elementary interactions with nature that cause effects that are useful.
Yeah. It
That's
says they might have discovered it long before churches and castles of medieval Scandinavia. So maybe, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, listen, I could be wrong. It could have been some other group or whatever.
Yeah.
What I understand is that as they lit fires, they discovered glass. It didn't mean they immediately created a production line of a window maker manufacturer.
Yeah.
They just basically discovered that something happened. And the happening for us in the something is beginning to interact with things accurately and notice that there's a confirmation that comes from that in our experience. We feel peace, we feel still, we feel quieter, we feel less compelled to be impulsive, reactive, compulsive. Starts to diminish, dilute, dissolve.
Until the part where you just don't care anymore about something. There's a fine line of like, I don't really care if something bothers me, to the fine line of, I don't really care about anything.
So if you're dissolving it, there's nothing there. If there's nothing there right now and we think there's something there, that's insanity. If all that's there is a thought thinking it's real and we think it's really there, that's insanity. It isn't to say we can't have that thought, and it isn't to say we can't think it's real. It's to say when we have the thought and we think it's real, we create what seems like a block that isn't real.
And some kids are just more sensitive, I guess, because somebody was showing me this, their child was saying he's very sensitive. He's very young and sensitive. So it's like, where does that come from? Why is one kid more sensitive than the other kid?
So, Anthony, are you listening to where I'm going with this, or are you just interjecting?
Well, I'm trying to figure out that we're kind of generalizing that everybody's the same, but some kids are just more sensitive. It's a different makeup that they have from the early age.
I haven't said everyone is the same. I've said the nature of our existence is the same. How we think is very different.
Yeah.
Each of us thinks differently. Nobody thinks the same as each other.
In the same situation, two people are going to possibly conceive it differently.
Well,
same thing, same facts, same everything.
But here's another thing. Two people are also often going to think they're seeing it the same way.
Yeah.
While in some way they're seeing it differently.
Yeah.
But think of that. Think of how easy it is to miss these points and think we really see it because people are saying, yes, I see it that way too.
Yeah.
In fact, the thinking they're doing, you'll see if you both think you see it correctly and then go to act on it, you're going to see that the thinking you had about it was very different because you're going to see somebody act in a very different way.
Yeah.
So it isn't to suggest we can't think separately, but that the basis of our thinking causes the same effects. If somebody's thinking something that isn't true is true, they're going to be disturbed in a similar way to you are. It may not be identical, and people may be numb to it because they've developed a defense that gives them the impression that it's not there. But numbness, when it's looked at accurately, is actually evidence of pain, not the diminishment or absence of pain. The body tends to go numb naturally when the pain would be too much to suffer. It's trying to protect us. Like calluses are a great example, where your skin's rubbing and rubbing and rubbing and rubbing against something, you develop a callus. Calluses aren't very sensitive. They're sort of the nerves get further and further away from the surface. So it isn't to suggest that we don't have billions of different ways we're doing this, Anthony. But if the basis of the doing is the same between us and we're ignoring that, we're going to think we've got to sort out billions and billions and billions of different ways, which would be impossible. Would be possible, but it would be highly improbable compared to simply starting to focus on the essence and realize it doesn't matter if people think differently, because if they're looking for the same result collectively, we would start to figure out how to act, how to think and act according to that thinking and that knowing in a much different way than we do trying to prove who we are is better or worse than others, and that we're better because others are worse.
So in a real life example, like I bought a business and I'm sitting there trying to figure out what to do with it, what's wrong with it, what's good about it, instead of ever realizing, you know what, whatever I'm thinking is probably not even right. And I never go to that fallout. Like, this is probably not even right, which I probably should do more. I always think I'm right about everything. So when I start analyzing, I think I'm using the right facts, but I'm really, if I just would understand, I'm probably making some mistakes here, it would be a little easier to deal with.
So in your real life experience that isn't happening now because you're not talking about a business, the real life experience you're having is being discounted and pushed aside. Think of that.
But yeah, let's talk about that. What do you mean?
Well, you just said, let's talk about a real life experience.
Yeah,
we're not really alive here now.
Oh, well, we're talking hypothetically.
No, we're not.
I thought we are.
No, we're not. We're talking actually and really. We're talking about truth and reality.
See, there you go. We're seeing it as two different things.
The seeing of it as two different things isn't the seeing of it, because the essence of this discussion is about truth being true and reality being real, and nature being natural, and it being our nature. And if it's our nature, it's shared. It's not something that's different for any of us, but what we choose to do with it seems different enough for us to each think our problems are so unique as to dominate the time that others may have sharing and talking, which may help describe your purge.
So I was just trying to see, like,
it's just orienting, Anthony. It's orienting around the idea that if there is an infinite source, and I'm not telling there is anybody, there is one.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be one anyhow. It wouldn't be numbered. So it couldn't even, everybody thinks about unity and one. That might work in the universe, but it doesn't work beyond the universe because it would be beyond counting. You couldn't have, nothing would be the opposite of something, right? In the limited universe.
Yeah.
But in an absolute state, and this is now getting into dimensions that we can't fathom within the construct of our comprehension, but we can certainly consider exist without having to understand them. We could understand at least that they exist, and that understanding alone might give us a window, literally like the Vikings, where there's no glass, but just simply a channel for the expression of those real things and those true, they're not even things, but reality and truth in an intuitive sense. If we weren't busy trying to think we needed to quantify it and understand it all in detail before we realize it's already perfectly understood. If it exists, it isn't coming from my thinking. It exists in everything, everywhere, anyhow, and everything beyond everything. It already exists. It's already there. If it's infinite. If, that's an if. Now, I say that not because I don't have confidence in that, but because if I was to tell you it's true, you would spend your life fighting my words, trying to make them yours, rather than think it's your decision to think whatever you want. It's your decision to come to terms with how things are. And if you begin entertaining these thoughts, you might notice they have a dramatic impact on your experience. And if they do, it might mean that you know more than you think you know. And what I say to you is irrelevant. And yet, if we talk about it openly, it starts to confirm that we both share something pretty profound. And profound, by the way, if you're seeking, means for finding. So it means having the thing we've always had and starting to notice it's always been here. It isn't somewhere else. It isn't someone else. It isn't something else. It's absolute. It's present. It's where we are. It's the nature of our awareness, the nature of our knowing. And we don't have to think about that for that to be true and for that to be real. And now the question is, if that's the case, what am I going to do about it? What am I going to do with it? Am I going to sit in my thinking and think that thinking has got to conclude it and come up with every little twist and turn to make sense of it? Or simply concede that it doesn't make, there is no way it can make no sense, because there's no irrational way that something that's absolute could exist. It can't be insane to exist, because insanity is seeing things that don't exist as reality. So it's beginning to concede that if this exists, we can call it God, we can call it whatever we want in any name or form. If we're even considering it, it starts to have an impact on our thinking, because our thinking has known it all along. Our thinking hasn't not known it. It's our use of the thinking that claims not to know it so that it can justify continuing to do this insane thing that we do, which is called addiction. And the addiction to thinking, that thinking is reality, is in fact the primary addiction to all forms of compulsions and impulsive and reactive behaviors. So certainly that wouldn't be our highest calling and our highest capacity. If we share that and talked about it, what would our conversation sound like compared to what our conversation sounds like when we're focused on our problems that we think are so monumental that we're going to sort it out and get better, when in fact we're trying to treat topically a symptom rather than notice the cause that's causing the problem? How would that conversation go? Aside from a lot of silence.
Jack,
Yes, Lindsay.
I want to say something.
Please.
I learned that if I had a ¿cómo se dice? Confrontation with somebody,
Yep.
and the flame, the fire is there, because I call that moment like a fire. I like to use my brain to think, how can find a solution, because I don't want my negative thought to ¿cómo se dice? Arruinar, to destroy friendships, relationship, or whatever. So I like to talk about, okay, we can find a solution, or I will be willing to do this and that, because I think that would be great, right? After a ¿cómo se dice? Confrontación.
Confrontation.
So
I like your
that
way.
is one thing that we can do, like
Yes.
as humans.
Yes.
But if the other part is giving up and that person is blocking, and it's hard to communicate. It's so hard.
If you think it's all based in thinking, you're right. It's hard because people are going to think what they want, and you're going to think that you'd like them to think what you want them to think, and you're going to wonder why they don't, and then think that by making an agreement, they really see what you're thinking, when in fact they're just seeing what you're thinking from their thinking. And there's always going to be some breach there in the whole. Because if the basis is thinking you're going to do it by your thinking, you don't think there's anything else you share with that person. You know, it's kind of like just taking a breath every minute and wondering why all the people you hang out with, asking everybody to just take one deep breath a minute and wonder why everybody you're hanging out with feels like they're suffocating. So if that person you're talking to, if you know that they have the same basis that you do in existence, and we call it spiritual, but I guarantee you to spirit, it's not spirit at all. That's just names we give these things to try to make some sense about them and have some reference point. If it is an essence, it just is that essence, whatever that essence is. We don't have to define it for it to be what it is. And if that person has it and you begin to notice that, your conversation changes with them. You don't want to extract an agreement from them as much as you want to see them achieve freedom from their own thinking so they can begin to express the loving nature that we all have, rather than simply come up with a contract that people are ultimately going to violate. There's no way to maintain all the contracts we have, the social contracts and all that, without violating them often, because circumstances change. They don't allow us to do every single one of those little things. If we did, we'd be hyper-focused on doing a little bit rather than actually engaging with the lot that's going on. And that would not be very appealing for most of us, to be looking at somebody who's only doing the least they can do, rather than starting to see that breaking those rules and breaking those bonds at times is really seeing what love is, which isn't held in bondage at all. There is no bondage. There's no limit in it. There's no contract in it. It's just a state of being that's absolute. If this is in fact real and true. So the test of it is, apply it. Just like 2 + 2, if you start applying 2 + 2 and it works, you probably can start seeing that 1 + 1 works too. If you're coming up with 4 and 2 as the answer. And all of a sudden math gets easier. Gets easier because you got a premise for it, and you start, then even out of 1 + 1 is 2, you can start to see, oh, well, then 2 + 1 would be 3. The rest of it all starts to make sense when the fundamental aspect of it becomes clear, or at least acted upon. My sense is it's clear. We think our thinking is so critical to reality that we create what we call a lack of clarity, a lack of transparency, a lack of connection. We think we're disconnected, but it's a thought that has no basis that we're feeling, not reality and truth. We're feeling the thought that we have that's disconnected. Something that's disconnected from reality has no basis in reality. Why wouldn't we feel alone if we thought we were that thought? Of course we feel alone. We feel desperate, as a matter of fact. Imagine being shipped out, 3 light years away from the Earth in a little capsule and just left there in space. Could be pretty desperate.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yes.
In olden days, they used to punish people by sending them out on ships. Their prison sentence was on a ship. They never got off the ship for 10 years. And when the ship was coming into port, they'd take the guy and put him on the ship leaving port. He'd be on the ocean for 10 years. It was punishment to isolate. Think of the punishment we suffer, the traumatic stress we suffer in the present, trying to make believe that all we think is truth and reality, when in fact reality and truth don't change whatsoever. But our experience changes a lot. What we think changes a lot, because if we're feeding our thinking from desperation, we're going to continue to have desperate thoughts, which is why the insane thought tends to lead to the insane thought. And if we keep thinking about it and thinking about it, we're not going to think much differently than that until we're willing to notice that our knowing nature, our absolute awareness, isn't based in thinking at all. It has no thinking, it isn't, thinking is of it, rather than reality and truth are of thinking. And that shift tends to change. For me in relationships, I began to see that I have a lot of ideas about what other people should be doing. They don't always line up with what people are doing. So if I have those ideas and they don't line up, I can start looking and saying, wow, I have a lot of ideas of what they should be doing, while what they're doing may even be better than my idea. And all of a sudden, rather than seeing the worst in them, I start saying, oh, it's my limitation that I'm struggling with. And all of a sudden, I can start seeing what they're doing is something wonderful and potential.
Oh, experiences. Because sometimes we have experiences who make us to take decisions like, I don't want to have friends because my friend, they
You might run into the problem you had with the other friend. Right.
Exactly. So it's nothing to do with the other person. Sometimes it's because we have our own bad experiences, period.
Well, let's just say that it's never has anything to do with the other person and everything to do with what we're thinking about it.
Yeah. See.
All the time.
Yes.
Now, it isn't, now all of a sudden that other person has a lot of freedom to do what they're doing, and you might be fascinated by that person in ways that you never bothered to even consider, because you're not sitting in judgment of what they're doing in relation to your thinking. You're starting to see what they're doing in relation to theirs, and what they're thinking might be very informative to you and might offer you a window of possibilities to do things you don't think you can do because you haven't thought you could do them, because you thought all you should be doing is what you thought you should be doing rather than what's possible. So my sense is, and this started, you came in a little bit late, the line that I wrote, and I miswrote it, by the way, in the email, but it said, it's not, I'm going to rewrite it, but it says it's not what is happening that causes our experience, but what we think of what's happening that determines our experience. So you see that? If you weren't thinking, your experience would be pure joy and abundance and peace if there were no thought. And during COVID, I did some research on near-death experience, and a big proportion of the people who have these near-death experience this enormous sense of peace. And my question is, why do we think we need to die before we can experience that peace on Earth? Why do we think we have to be in Earth before we can rest in peace, rather than on Earth in peace, sharing that peace, expressing that peace, coming not from desperation, but from inspiration?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
So I have a wife. I love her. I don't always like what she does. And I've gotten better at saying, I don't always like that. And as a matter of fact, I don't ever seem to like that. And now that she knows I'm just sharing my thoughts, she doesn't react. She just generally laughs and says, well, get used to it
That is
if you
beautiful.
want. But what's interesting is, in the freedom, she started to become more accountable with me, because she said things like, I guess I don't need to always do that. She started to see there's actually flexibility, rather than she needs to be entrenched in a position that she thought defined her. That as long as anybody wanted to fight, she was going to maintain at all costs, because it seems to be slipping, her life seemed to be slipping away by these compromises being made. And she starts laughing, and we start laughing, and just like being children together and really appreciating each other. Doesn't always
That is
happen.
beautiful.
Doesn't always happen, because when I want to be authentic about something and I've never talked about it, it can very much seem like a threat to her. But I know it's a threat to my continuing to keep it to my seeming self. By being quiet about it isn't really helping, because it's building. And I know if I let it build, I'm going to explode at some time, or I'm going to implode. One or the other is going to happen. And I know it. So when I get to those points, I say, look, I'm going to share something with you that has to do with you, but it's all about what I'm thinking. But it's not always easy, because we do so little of this. To receive that means starting to see it from a spiritual basis rather than a reactive basis. Because if what I'm thinking is that my thinking is real, and somebody shares something that's authentic for them, I'm going to hear them saying to me what's wrong with me. I'm going to hear them criticizing me and faulting me and blaming me. I'm not going to hear them sharing honestly with me. I'm going to hear that they're blaming me. I'm going to feel defensive and reactive, which is how this whole thing gets converted into this perversion, this other version of reality. It isn't true. It's just all make-believe. It's all fantasy. It's all Disneyland, where you don't have to pay to get in, but once you do, you don't want to be there. It's like if Disneyland was free, nobody'd go. It'd be way too crowded. That's how our head is. So the turning, if we're told in sobriety very often to act contrary, and you're not in sobriety, Lensis, but often we're told to act contrary, which means that we're admitting we're thinking contrarily. And if we simply stop to notice, we don't have to do the hateful, spiteful, contemptful, angry, hostile thing. If we can stop it, it's because we're thinking we know we can stop it, that we're stopping it. And we can also track back and start noticing that we don't have to start those thoughts that get us to that point where we think it's the only thing we can do.
Exactly. And that
That
is
flexibility.
emotion. Yes. And emotion, ¿cómo se dice? Inteligencia emocional. That is too. I know that, like, inteligencia emocional. Yeah, you're right. And that is what I'm doing. Yes. Emotional
Intelligent emotions.
intelligence.
Yeah.
Yes. So I
Well,
understand that. Mhm.
And that's emotional sobriety. By our emotional sobriety is sanity.
Mhm.
It's sane living. It's beginning to practice principles. And what greater principle could we practice than to begin to notice that when we believe thoughts are real, we begin to believe who we are is what we think. And if we're thinking that, we're never going to have a peaceful emotional intelligence. We're going to have emotional turmoil and mental anguish because the basis of our thinking about reality and truth is wrong, to make believe that we make it up rather than say, I can make up whatever I want. But I'm going to live with the consequences of what I express. I'm going to live with the consequences of what I think. And I may not like those consequences. And when I become familiar with that, I become a lot more willing just to do what I think rather than wonder whether or not it's right and how I'm going to be seen, what people are going to think. All that other kind of stuff doesn't go with that. I just go out and challenge nature and say, you show me now where I'm wrong. I'm going to try this way, and I may land on my face, but that'll help me learn how to get to my feet and start to actually interact with bravery and courage, because I'm not discouraged by the thinking I'm doing. I'm not constantly thinking I have to be right before I do something and then realize, how can I possibly be right when my thinking's wrong to begin with? I'm going to wait forever to do anything and wonder why I feel disconnected and non-productive and useless and disconnect or unable to help and be of any real service or use to others, benefit.
Yeah. Flexibilidad is the best. Flexibilidad and growing is good.
Well, keep in mind, if everything's changing, imagine how flexible everything is for everything to always be changing. It's so flexible that every moment it's not what it just was, ever, 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 ever. It's always new. And what does that mean? The presence is always new. That's where we always are. It's where everything happens. It's where every thought we have is. It's where every breath we take is, always in the present.
So you're saying that the sun is always moving, that eventually it'll be in the right spot where I want it.
Well, I would say, Anthony, it's already in the right spot since it's where it is. And it's only your thoughts you're struggling with.
It's going to get better. It's possible that it gets better. It's not, it's always changed. So when I look at the sun and go, hey, it's not where I want it, it's like, yeah, give it some time.
Well, if all you ever think of is worse, it's certainly possible it could get better.
Yeah.
Think of that. Think of how easy the benchmark is better when all you think of is what's worse.
Thank God I didn't get off this meeting when I thought it just wasn't working anymore. I stuck it out.
Well, you're working it all right.
So what does the test look like? Let's talk about the final exam. We've been studying a hell of a long time.
It's what you make of it, Anthony. It's what you do. It's your own application of these ideas that will transform your experience. And you're already doing it. And the question is, do you like the experience you're having? Are you happy with it? Do you feel fulfilled?
The proof is in the pudding. The proof is in the pudding.
Well, in the pudding correctly, Putting, which is like in the putting. But it's really in the putting forth principled ideas.
Yeah.
That you are affirmed, confirmed, and then conformed to. It would make no good sense to learn that if you didn't think a step was there, that you could take that step and not fall to the level of that step.
Or instead of me being mad that I don't have the sunrise, I should be happy that, hey, think about how perfect it must be shining.
All you're doing is flipping the same problem, Anthony. You're thinking if you don't do it this way, you should just do it that way. All that you're doing in that.
That's what I do. I'm glad you brought that up. That's a good point. I just try to
not have to make that. You don't
I
have
just
to
try to problem solve everything. I got to quit problem solving. That's the problem.
But you're creating problems to solve constantly. That's the part you're missing.
Yeah, maybe that's true.
They're not problems until you think of them as they aren't, just like reality. Reality,
Yes.
truth don't
I
seem
got to look
like a
at
problem.
this. I got to examine this. I got to study this a little bit more.
Well, Anthony, congratulations. Because that's
Thank
the
you.
application, the willingness, the openness, starting to see, what does the book say? Honesty, openness, willingness. What's honestly? It's
Yeah.
actually letting things be as they are, not as I think they are. And then
Right.
starting to notice that how I
Right.
think they are is honest when I start.
Finally, I'm not on the first chapter anymore. I'm so tired of being a first chapter all the time. This is
Oh,
like
no,
towards
you're
the end.
still on it. Don't worry about that.
I just skipped it. I'm skimming ahead.
There are no chapters. There's only verse. It's
Wow.
only a version and it's only a verse. It's only how we decide. Think of the universe being one verse.
Whoa. God, Jack, you just always amaze me. 2 hours later, and I'm amazed.
We're
3 years.
surrounded by it and we're acting as though it isn't happening.
A verse. If you're averse to something, think about being averse to it.
Yeah, you think more about that, please.
Just the word, I mean, averse.
No,
Instead of
I know.
universe. It's
I know,
averse.
but think of that in terms of your experience.
Yeah.
You think you can oppose the universe. You
And I
think
am opening up a new guitar right now as we're speaking. So maybe that's part of it.
Can you play it?
Well, yeah, actually I could, but I don't want to take away from the therapy time. I'll have it. We'll talk about it later on when it's not just right for me and something's wrong.
so. If the nature of our existence is in absolute perfect order, what are we generally talking about?
What's not right with it? The opposite of that.
No, because the opposite of something absolute would be the same. It would still be absolute. We're talking.
Are you serious? Jesus Christ. The opposite of absolute is absolute?
Yeah. There's no.
I did not.
There's
I would
no
have got that
change
one
in it.
wrong. Shit.
Only in a relative experience you have this opposing seeming magnetic forces. It's not part of an absolute state of being. It's part of a relative context, which is
Jana,
what.
did you know that one? Let me ask Jana. Did you know the opposite of absolute is absolute?
Yeah, I did because Jack's told us before.
All right.
Several hundred times, Anthony.
Thousands of times, like every day.
See how great it is? I learned things like it's so new. It's so exciting.
Well, but Anthony, in one respect, you're actually admitting it is new all the time. Even the old thoughts we're having, we're always having.
Yeah.
We're having newly.
Thank you.
But
God.
you think of them as a habituation and a habit, as though
Even
the
when
old
I'm
thought
wrong, I'm
condemns
right.
you to the new thought. Think of that.
Yeah.
The old thought
God.
doesn't condemn you to the new thought because the new thought's always new, regardless of your condemnation of it.
Yeah. And think about how terrible it is for the sun. The sun does all this work. It's the most incredible thing in the world, and there's still some guy mad at it. It's like, hey,
Well,
there's probably a lot.
Think of the beauty of that. The sun has no regard because it's doing what it's doing. It certainly isn't worried about what people think of it.
Right.
Now, we get concerned about what people, self-consciousness is basically undue regard for appearance. Wouldn't it be odd if a self is conscious? That would be a highly elevated state of awareness. And yet, what is it? We're afraid of what other people think. Why? Because we're scared to death about the thinking we're doing because it's killing us. And yet we say, people say I was scared to death. And I said, that's interesting. You live to tell about it.
Yeah. And you know what? I wasn't going to bring it up about the sun because it's so bad. It's so mental. It's so trivial. But actually, it ended up helping because I see it doesn't care. The sun, sharks don't care about Monday.
No, it does care. You know what it cares, Anthony? Is that it do what it's designed to do. And it doesn't think about it. So it doesn't hesitate. It doesn't withdraw. It doesn't pull back. It doesn't do all the games we play to make believe we're not doing what we're doing. It doesn't say, you know what? These people have been bad for a year and I'm not coming out on Christmas. That's the end of it. I'm not going to do that. You know why? Because it knows what it knows, just as we know what we know. And we've been operating on the basis that all we know is what we think so long that we think all we know is all there is to know. And that has diminished our capacity to actually know what the sun knows because it is the same basis that we know. That sun is part of this same universe that we live in, or at least we're experiencing within this human life form that we have. And there is no difference in the subatomic level to all of those issues that are going on. And if there are differentiations at all in relation to everything else, they're doing exactly what they're designed to do perfectly to orchestrate this moment and allow us the chance to even discuss whatever we're discussing.
Yeah, and I just heard that the Earth takes 365 days to travel around the sun. And how long do you
You
think
just
it takes the
heard
sun?
that?
Well, the rest of it. That how long do you think that?
What do you think a year is?
Hey, so but how? This is the part. So it takes the Earth 365 days to go around the sun. How long does it take the sun to go around the Milky Way galaxy?
It's hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah, it's got the sun has been around billions of years. It's gone around 3 times so far.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So everything goes round and round. Think of that.
Yeah.
It always seems
round and round.
It always seems to come back to where it starts, but it never does, because we're never in the exact same space that we're traveling through. We're doing an orbit around the sun, but it's never in the exact same space. So the point is that thoughts that come round, that go round, are never old. They're always new. We only think of them as old so we can feel condemned to them, be it by thinking of a past that doesn't exist as condemning us. When it's
I
the
think
thought
we're really
about
getting
it,
somewhere.
it's the thought about it that's contemptful, and as a result, we feel condemned.
Yeah.
The immediacy of what we're doing that's causing our experience, not the problem we think we have. When we see that, the problem starts to take a proportionate, according to the problem, becomes proportionate rather than disproportionate, just like thinking becomes something we're doing rather than something we are. Rather than being engulfed in it is the only thing we can do, it starts to simply be something we're doing by choice. It takes it from being everything to being something. And all of a sudden, we have a chance to begin to look at things accurately and function on a level that we can express our knowing nature through our thinking, which is what thinking's designed to do, because it knows exactly what to do when it's being asked to express truth and reality. That's what intuition is. Intuition is knowledge beyond reason, which means there's no thinking, no process, no rationale, no logic involved. It is knowing it knows, period. There's no doubt in it, no uncertainty, no instability. So if we're feeling unstable mentally, we're feeling unstable thoughts. If we're feeling disabled, we're feeling thoughts that have no ability. Those are natural consequences because we're designed to survive and to thrive, not to implode and kill ourselves. The design is there. It's possible because we have the freedom to do whatever we want, but it is not the highest and best use, because it doesn't help the most. And I mean the most being others in any of their struggles that they may be going on through.
I like it.
Expansion can go on forever. Contraction eventually comes to a point where it explodes. And that basically defines the Big Bang.
There's a lot of math and science in this program, I've noticed.
Well, math is a study, and if we're studying our experience and starting to accurately assess it, it's a study. I mean, that's all of the logos, sociology and all the different forms, logos, I believe, if I remember right, is study. So we're studying the functionality of our absolute existence.
And think about how my day starts. I go out to get the paper and I'm mad at something that's billions of years old, right? I'm like, screwing up my day. And it's actually funny, where I wasn't laughing before when I was mad.
Right. Well, when you start to see that the silliness of the gesture you impose on yourself is having a thought appear to be who you are, this imposter, it doesn't seem funny when you're taking it seriously. Because it seems like a death threat when anybody challenges it. But when you start looking at it honestly, it starts to be a joke, because that's what it is. And you can see that it's very laughable to even have considered that and then say, that had to be insane to think that. And that's the final answer, by the way. It's insanity. So logos is a word, interesting. is the rational principle that governs and develops the universe. So sociology, all the different ologies in academia and all that stuff are really looking for the principles. What actually works? How can we look at things accurately enough to utilize it productively enough that it offers the best benefit, the most productivity, abundance, which I would suggest is an expression of an abundant reality accurately. If we're thinking of it accurately, we're going to express it accurately. If we're expressing it accurately, we're going to be abundant in ways that go well beyond the impact we think we're having, because we're going to start to be aware that we've been having an impact on everything, everywhere, the whole time. We just haven't wanted to admit that we've had anything to do with it. The same way it's hard for us to think that when we have a thought we want something and we get the thing we want, we realize it's not quite what we wanted. Or if we get there and think, which if it isn't what we wanted, we think now it's unwanted. And how could I have ever thought this would be the thing? Because we thought the thought was true. All that should ever happen as a result is that we get exactly what we thought we would get. The interesting thing is we're not happy where we are thinking the thought about getting something somewhere else. So when we get to that somewhere else that's also in the present, we're certainly not going to be well schooled in feeling the abundance of that moment, only the lack in what we thought we should have gotten.
And I like the guitar that I got. That's a perfect note. I finally like something. That's it.
Well, let's see how that goes tomorrow.
Isn't that great? Yeah, let's check in tomorrow. Let's do it. I was going to say we need to do more meetings, Jack.
Well, I would suggest applying more of what you hear more regularly, and you're going to start noticing that the absolute knowledge you have, Anthony, is in perfect order. You do not need me to repeat this stuff.
No, yeah, I definitely do.
You really
I'll be
don't.
mad at that son. I'll be mad at that son again tomorrow. You watch.
Well, then I'm not helping. I mean, the ultimate point of this is to apply what you're hearing in any way and starting to notice if it doesn't help you distinguish an absolute knowing sense that's at peace and calm from an interbulated mental anguish that's easily caused by the immediacy of thoughts making believe thoughts are true and real, making believe what we think is reality, making believe who we are is what we think.
That's a good summary. I like that. A great summary.
Well, thank you. My goal is to quantify this simply enough that we can have an outline and everybody can just read it and you can keep it on your phone and do it.
And it'd always be the same. No two people ever interpret it the same.
Well, the fact is, if they're considering something infinite, think of the big book. It gives us the chance to define our own God, a God of our own understanding. What does that mean? It just means that we're coming to terms with something we can't understand in terms of the limited nature of our thinking about the thinking. So it's giving us the freedom to recognize that it doesn't matter how we think about the infinite. If we're thinking about the infinite at all, it does us a lot of good because it stabilizes our experience immediately because we're not completely obsessed with thinking that's unstable. So our experience shifts. So it's giving us that freedom because that's how it is. Nobody thinks of God the same.
Yeah.
And yet, if it's infinite, it is the same. It's kind of like in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. There's one program written one way. And what does everybody say?
It's for themselves.
Develop your own program, right? But the fact that it's principled, the benefits convey to all, no matter how they interpret them. Yeah. Even people that don't quite do it. Bill even said, he said, you can be half out of your mind, or you can have grave emotional and mental disorders and still have a better than still have it less. You have less than an average chance of succeeding, but you still have a chance. He said,
yeah.
It's still
what
possible.
Was the biggest problem you had with AA when you first got into it? Or what was, how everybody kind of picks their one thing that they don't like about it? Seems like
the control freaks.
Yeah, I mean, I thought I was going to lose my reputation until I realized my reputation was being negligent and reckless. I just thought being associated as an alcoholic is like living. All I saw was a guy in the gutter with his pants down around his knees, sleeping, in like Robinson Crusoe pants. And, I said, well, I don't do that, so I can't possibly have that problem.
How about the homeless problem there? Is it getting worse and worse where you're at?
No.
It's not.
They've actually imposed some limits, so people are finding their way and they're deciding they need help rather than give them the
Wow.
impression the only thing they can do is more drugs. So it started to actually help.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, I feel better, you guys. Thanks for listening.
Anthony, if
I
you're
guess
looking
getting a
at
new-
stuff accurately, you should be feeling worse. Because
I feel
some of
better.
the things we're struggling with, we're
I
not
already went
hitting.
through that worse. That's what we talked about. You do feel worse, but I'm past that. There, you go through. It's an ebbs
No,
and flows.
It's a pendulum. Yes, you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
But the point is that feeling better in mental health is starting to notice that you're just getting better at feeling. It's not about feeling good all the time. It's not about feeling great. It's about starting to feel what you're feeling. And as you do, you'll start to acknowledge the thinking you're doing. Because in
That's
the
what
feeling,
they say by feel better. Sorry.
all of
You
our
start to
feelings
feel
are
better.
all of our feelings are associated to thoughts because we name them. Right?
Yeah.
Good, bad, sad, happy, mad, all those names come through thoughts. So the immediacy of cause and effect are always happening. They're immediate. And to miss the thought as being the cause always precedes the effect, but the effect is immediate. So there's no time involved at all. It's just constant. But the cause is the cause.
Yeah.
If you're not promoting the cause of the thought, you're not going to have the consequence of the feeling, the effect. So as you begin to realize that the nature of nature is natural and you're natural, you'll start realizing what's unnatural a lot quicker and just see it as something you're doing that's wrong rather than thinking of it as something wrong you need to constantly do until you get it right. And that's really the turn from addiction in all forms compulsively to seeing the addiction in the mental form that can be a very slippery thing to seem to find. But if
It's
you look
interesting too. I don't know.
If you look at your experience and the effects, you'll see quickly that you do know what's going on because you feel bad, you feel wrong, you feel guilty, you feel shame, you feel all these things are telling you you're doing something you're guilty for. You're ashamed of what you're doing. When we begin to assign it to our thinking rather than everyone and everything else, it becomes possible that we can do something about it. And until that point, we think there's nothing else that can be done, which is exactly why we keep doing and doing and doing and doing the wrong thing in the name of thinking someday it will be right. It's exactly what we do with drugs and alcohol, thinking I'm going to get there. At some point, I'll understand everything clear enough and I'll be able to stop because the world will just crystallize into this ideal place that won't trigger me, that won't have anything going on that I don't like.
Yeah. Yeah. Till the sunroof on the limo doesn't work.
Down at the arena. Lakers get the win as they return home in 8-2.
So I feel better.
Jack,
Yes, Lindsay.
I want to say something very special. Anthony, I want you to know that I respect you and I love you. And thank you so much for bringing me to this meeting.
For the first time, Anthony's speechless.
Right?
See, Jack had me muted. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I thought there was a sports game going on in somebody's.
Yeah, sorry, it was.
Yeah.
But I love you too, and I'm grateful you're here, and that all you guys are in my life, and that I tell 100 people about this meeting, and 1 out of 100 stick. So you have a lot to share. I knew you. That's why I love you so much, because you already have what Jack's talking about.
And you know what? The most interesting thing is more than 10 years ago, when I was facing something very dark in my life, I had no one to talk. When I heard my first time, Jack, I connect with he was talking about because everything starts with pain, and all we are in the same frequency of experiencias, and connect us. So I had so much compassion with this topic because I was one of those person who feel the pain in life and all that kind of stuff. So Jack has so much love and compassion, and he had a lot of knowledge, and I know that. So I love to Yeah, I understand, and I'm so
Thanks.
happy to be in here. It's like a therapy. It's something
She wanted
amazing.
she wanted to know how much you charge after the first meeting. She
Mhm.
couldn't believe you were doing it at no charge.
I-
She's like, how much
because,
does Jack charge?
I had experience attending secret ¿cómo se dice? Secretas meetings.
Secret societies.
Yeah, and
Cults,
they
yeah.
are very expensive, and it's like in therapy and psychology and all that kind of stuff. And Jack had these, and it's for us. It's amazing.
yeah.
Well,
Not
let
all
me-
of us can
Amazing.
express ourselves like that.
Let me
You're able
let
to
me
express
tell you
yourself.
though, what the only thing I have done maybe that is different than others is talked about it a lot. So I have friends that say Jack is obsessed with the obsession. So I don't
I don't
talk
think so.
well, I try to clarify also that there's actually inspiration looks a lot like obsession, because my sense is this is
Wow.
the purpose we are here for, and to not talk about it is to miss that purpose. And to start talking about it is also to acknowledge that it's not what I say, it's not that I say it, it's that we already all know it. And if that message gets across, anyone can sit anywhere and close their eyes and just simply ask themselves, if I already know it, what is it that I'm doing that's causing the impression that I don't know it? And
Wow.
start to actually isolate the thinking as being the problem. And it becomes very obvious when you're looking at it clearly, because when you look from an infinite place of view, which is our point of view, it's actually not a point at all, it's just our observatory capacity. All of a sudden, thinking seems very small than the way it seems when we think
Yeah.
in it and we're engulfed by it, we can't get out of it and we're stuck. It's kind of like putting my hand to my eyes and saying the world all of a sudden looks a lot like my fingers.
But Jack, I noticed and I learned that we can attack this kind of conversation with ¿cómo se dice? Not everyone has this knowledge. It's not everyone, because I had that kind of experiences. They don't understand you, so you
my thinking,
understand
though,
us.
My thinking is, Lensis, everybody knows it. They don't think they know it. And to the degree that we commit to those thoughts, we become defensive about those thoughts. And so we become reactive to hearing there may be another way of doing it, because we feel so alone and desperate. We think we're the only ones that can save us, and we end up creating the isolation that kills us. That makes no sense. If that's what we're doing collectively, and that's obviously a generalized statement, I'm not a medical professional and I don't do this from that point of view. My sense is if we've been thinking wrong has been right since the beginning of, the old story of Cain and Abel, and Cain kills his brother and God says, Cain, where's your brother? And God, he says, I don't know. Lying has been at the core of the human history that we've written about our own experience. To not notice it is to continue to perpetuate it. And to pretend it isn't happening is to pretend that it's the only thing that's happening, because we end up fighting what's actually happening in the name of all that we think is happening, which can't be true, but it can seem true to the limited thinking we're doing that just goes around and around and around and around, and literally like a cannibal eats itself. And historically, cannibals have not been known to eat themselves. The thing that's despicable about them is that they kill people to eat people, not themselves. If they killed themselves, it would eliminate the cannibal problem pretty quickly. So it isn't what I say, it's what you do with what I say. And it isn't because I say there's an infinite source. If there is an infinite source, it's because there is an infinite source. And when we talk about it accurately, we begin witnessing the benefits of that accuracy and can begin to apply it to any of the disturbances we see, as simply recognizing that we're thinking something that isn't true as truth and causing that disturbance as a result. I don't have to know what that thought is to simply have a relationship to it that says whatever it is, whatever I'm thinking about is sick. And if I have a relationship to it that's accurate, all of a sudden the thing that I thought was hidden all of a sudden becomes obvious too. I start seeing where it is that I'm thinking wrongly, and largely I'm going to see it in my relationships with other people. So to think they don't understand it doesn't keep me from talking about it. They can say they don't understand it as long as they want, and they can be stuck in their thinking as long as they want. And I can continue to reinforce the fact that what they know isn't what they think, and who they are is not what they think, and they are in perfect order regardless of what they think. And sometimes I run into kids on the beach here that I used to have these conversations with, and I would say to them who were addicts, like drop dead addicts. Many of them who I see now who are working and have re-engaged with society and are happy. And one of them I saw the other day, and I said, I could tell you're sober. And he said, how? And I said, you don't have any black eyes. This guy used to always be in a fight with somebody, always had a black eye. But I would talk to them and say, look, do you think this is possibly the best you could be doing? And they would almost inevitably start laughing because they knew, and I said, where's your mother? Where's your mom right now? And they'd tell me, and I said, do you talk to her? And they said, no. And I said, you may feel worse about what you're doing than she does, because I know she's thinking of you and concerned right now. Call her, give her a call. Start there. It would start to unravel that isolation that people get stuck in. And when you're hanging out with people that are stuck in the same thing you're doing, you begin to think it's all that's happening when it isn't. It's a choice to hide out and think that you're going to, Jana calls it co-conspirators. You're going to create this conspiracy of dunces that is somehow going to save you when there's no intellect in it at all. Ignorance, surprisingly, is not intellect. Ignoring things doesn't make you smarter. Sensitivity makes you smarter. Sensitivity is awareness, which is intellect. If we're sensitive to what's happening, even if it's distressing, and we simply say, I'm distressed, I'm worried. And even that isn't correct, because what I'm thinking about is worrying me. I'm saying I am worried, which I'm not. I'm worried about my thinking, is what I'm really saying. And yet I'm so used to it, with all the talking I do about it, I still misstate it in that regard. So it's not I am worried, but it is my thinking I'm worried about. And for good reason. You know why? I'm not worried because it's right. I'm worried because something I'm doing about it is wrong. Period. If I start seeing that, it literally starts to dissolve. So there's no resolution that needs to be repeated to make it feel better all the time. It starts to go away, so it isn't even there. And then what happened for me is I started sitting still and say, now what? Like I had no impulse to do anything. And I began to realize I can do everything. I don't have to do anything to know that I can do everything. Everything that can be done is possible. And then start to pick and choose things on a constructive, healthy basis rather than on a reactive, desperate basis, constantly fueling the reactivity and defensiveness to make believe it's the only thing I can do insanely. So I talk about this because of my own weaknesses, and I want to get better at talking about it. And you guys give me that opportunity.
Thank you. This is
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
yes.
I thank you guys. I mean, we started this during COVID when people couldn't talk for a while, and started doing it I had done this one-on-one with people for years, but I realized I wasn't helping them one-on-one figure out how to do this in society and how to carry this. So doing it as a group gives us a chance to be in front of others, listening to what we're saying openly. And remember, when we're out in public, we can do it there too, and start to actually notice the natural direction. Doesn't mean people have to understand it or hear it. And if you get a reaction out of it, what I realized is that when I was getting reactions, it was confirming the fact that everybody was either reactive or receptive. They were either response-able or reactive, habitually defending. And I didn't see it as wrong. I just didn't see it as right anymore. And I started seeing that it was an experience they were struggling with, and I had compassion for them rather than think they needed to do something, began to say, let them just do what they're doing. Because there's nobody amongst us that can hurt us as much as we can hurt our own experience.
Let me tell you about a girl I love. She looks so fine.
There's nothing that can hurt our experience more than the immediacy of our own thinking, because it is where our pain and pleasure zones are. So it's not what you do that bothers me, it's what I think about what you're doing that bothers me more. And to miss that point is to think everyone else is to blame and fault and feel it's impossible to live, when in fact it's very possible to live, because life is all possibility. Life is not difficult, it's not complicated, it's what we think of it that becomes difficult and complicated and not simple. Life is simple, it does what it does and does all it does. And it's the source of all possibility, including, by the way, our possibility to exist in this human form, in these human relations, on this planet, in this universe, in the galaxies, etc. So we've gone from here to there and back in a matter of a split second. There and then,
awesome.
there and then is here and now all the time. So if there's any place to fix anything that's broken, it's where we are, not where we need to get or with what we need to have. It's already here. We already have everything. And all the knowledge, including the distress that seems to be difficult to live with. If it's so difficult, why do we keep living with it so easily and so perpetually? Because we want it. We want to use it as to hide behind and think that it's happening to us rather than being caused by us. When it starts to disappear, my experience is I had a lot of tears because I was sad for a lot of the relations I had that I could never be fully engaged in. While I was fully engaged, I wasn't doing the things I could have done at a human level to reaffirm that and to conform to that thinking, to confirm and conform. So there was sadness built up. And largely the sadness was that I actually discounted an absolute loving source and made it only what I think it was and thought of it only in terms of my thinking rather than noticing that this abundant absolute state of being is always present and was never diminished and can't be diminished. It can't be changed. That's why it's simple. So it's easy. The easiest thing to complicate is simplicity. Because anything I think about it that isn't simple is complicated, period. And since my thinking's always changing, there's a good chance my thinking is not only the source of complications, but it's going to complicate things. So if I notice that, I can see, well, this is something I do in thought. It doesn't condemn me. It's just a possibility of thought if I'm thinking incorrectly. And if I'm willing to at least align with the thinking I'm doing correctly, authentically, genuinely, honestly, all of a sudden that sense of knowing becomes clearer. And I start to deal with the think because the thinking begins to vanish, that it doesn't get resolved where I have to resolve it over and over again. It literally vanishes because it dissolves. And the word dissolve is no solution, meaning there was never any problem other than the delusion I had a problem. If my only problem is thinking I have a problem, then the problem is the thinking. So emotional sobriety is beginning to function on that basis and apply that thinking that's principled, that will not change. Principles don't change. They'll always work. When I apply in that direction, I will get feedback that confirms the application is correct. So I love doing this. I love you guys. Everyone listening, you're a part of that. And anyone who wants to communicate, there's an email that'll get to us however it does. And we appreciate you listening and also understanding that this is meant for you. And what we do this for together for each other is meant for a broader audience, which is why we agreed to have it recorded and available so that people could sit back and listen and recognize that you two are an absolute part of this, regardless of being beyond the scope of the few people that come every week to talk about it directly. Some of whom, like Anthony, have done it for a long time.
Hey, maybe we could hear from Jackie too. She's been a little bit quiet there.
Hi, I've been driving and stuff.
Okay.
Hi, everybody.
Hi,
Hi, Jackie.
How's Jackie doing?
Hi, miss you guys.
Hello.
It's
How's
so
Jackie
good to see
doing?
everybody.
I saw
I'm
you on
great.
TikTok, Jackie, and you looked absolutely gorgeous.
Oh my God, you're so sweet. Thank
Like
you.
ridiculously gorgeous.
Oh my God, thank you. It's because of this work.
Well, you just look amazing. You look 10 years younger.
Oh my God, thank you. I wonder if I had a filter on.
No, you did not.
Oh,
No.
good.
I
Thank you.
saw like 5 of them, and you just look gorgeous and happy and healthy.
Oh my God, thank you.
Is it one of your
Of
shows?
course. She was just doing all kinds of different things. There was one about her helping people to her program with taking people running, and then just it's TikTok. It's just little short things.
The homeless people, right?
Yeah.
They're
People
not
in recovery?
homeless. They're people in recovery, but they're
Yeah.
people in in rehabs that they just got out of jail or they went there instead of jail. So I'm taking them running, and it's just the most beautiful work I've ever done in my life. It's so cool.
So
See, that's why you
using that also to see that even society has come to terms with the fact that incarcerating people for drug abuse when it's an illness probably isn't the best way to deal with it. And we've had
Right.
tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people locked up for the sake of drug use. Now, I'm not suggesting that people that are on drugs that do things that are much more criminal than simply use drugs may not need some added attention. But the point is that things that used to seem intractable have changed socially as people have become aware that what they were doing wasn't working. And our awareness is critical to that kind of thinking. Talking about it openly and publicly helps other people who think addiction's impossible and nobody can be helped, starts to change that mode of thinking socially. It's absolutely possible to help people. People are not beyond help. They are absolutely capable of recovery. And it's
these guys said, they're like, this is some of our only encouragement we've ever gotten in our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. And they're so willing to like be vulnerable. I have them do their gratefuls after or talk about how running has made them feel better than they did before running. And they're always so willing to be vulnerable. It's like they have tattoos on their faces. They've been in gangs. They show me their bullet wounds and stabbing wounds. And it's just beautiful. I'm very, very happy and blessed to be doing it.
That's great. Yeah, it's very confirming, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't even do anything. I just show up. And one of the guys lost 100 pounds and ran the full marathon in less than a year. And then he took another guy under his wings, and they both are like running, one just ran 54 miles in less than a year. And I'm their coach,
Wow.
and I'm not even doing anything. I'm just showing up.
So they're no longer running from themselves, and they're getting better.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They're way better. And it's just beautiful. It's really, there's nothing more beautiful, I don't think.
It's really, well, and you said it, you're really not doing anything but showing up. It takes so
I'm doing
little
nothing.
to do.
I'm doing nothing but showing up.
When we're doing what's natural, which is literally standing on principles, it just happens. And when we're doing what's unnatural, it takes all of our effort. People die trying to do what can't be done. It creates all the impossibility we witness and all the opinions that become such a cacophony that everybody will often think that's all we can do. It's not true. So doing that and talking about it makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
People are absolutely redeemable, and nobody I've ever come across doesn't want to be better. Nobody.
Yeah.
They may sickly think that's all they can do, but as they come out of that, they start saying, you know what? It's a lot more I can do. And they start being confirmed by seeing other people help by something they say that they thought at some point they should never say and never air out in public. And it becomes the thing that actually lights somebody else up and says, oh, I'm not alone. I am a part of this. There is something here that's absolutely grounded in my experience, in my life, in my knowingness.
Yeah, it's really cool. Beautiful.
Yeah.
And you help me be in the moment with them.
Well, and I would say I can't help you with that, but I can help you remember that you always are. Remember that that's our nature, regardless of what we think, because we can't not be in the present, just like we can't be outside of the grace of a loving absolute power. There's no chance. But we can think we can. And my experience is that gratefulness is really beginning to admit the fullness of greatness that we have, that we've been given.
Ooh, Jack. Have you said that before?
Yes, hundreds of times.
Yeah, he says that all the time, Jackie. Well,
Jackie's been running marathons. Well, we've been talking for 2 hours. She's been running a marathon.
That's beautiful. I'm so excited.
Say it again, Jack. Say it again. I kind of missed it. Say it again.
That gratefulness is beginning to act on and express the full greatness that we have. So it isn't to what I tell guys who make grateful lists is I said, that's giving you an indication that you know that there's something to be grateful for. But as you begin to realize that the fullness of that greatness is your nature, that will become an ever-present state of mind rather than something you need to do occasionally because mentally you think it's not true. You're not going to be correcting anything. You're simply going to be expressing reality rather than thinking about it as something you need to come to terms with. It's the mistaken identity that causes so much grief because we begin to think we become engulfed in the flames of that torturous process.
I have to go, you cuties. I love you guys so much.
Love you too,
Oh,
Jackie.
we
Thank
love
you
you,
very much.
honey.
Love
you all.
you. Thank you. Bye.
Keep up the good work,
Bye.
Jackie.
Thank you.
Aloha.
Bye, Jackie. Happy
Aloha.
holiday.
Love you.
We'll be
Love you,
back
baby.
for
Bye.
we'll be back for 2 more
Mhm.
weeks and maybe do some things in between to make up for the couple we're going to miss at the end. If anybody wants to do a smaller group during the week or something, I'd be willing to do that.
Right on.
I do.
Love
Okay,
you guys.
love you guys. Thank
Thanks,
you,
Jack.
Jack. You're
Bye, all.
amazing. I love you. Bye,
Bye,
Anthony.
Jack.
I love
Thank
You
you.
too.
Bye,
You too.
honey.
Thank you,
Bye.
Lensis, for your comments.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah.
That's how we feel, but we're not as good as expressing it as you are.
Thank
That's
you
how we
for
all
being
feel.
here.
Hey, here's
I
one last
love
song.
you.
Let me do the song.